It was January the 3rd, 1921, 101 years ago today. A tragedy that struck a family, not in just one area, but almost exactly at the same time in two different New South Wales suburbs. One family was impacted greatly by tragedy. In summer in Australia, we love to get near the beach, near the sea, and spend our holiday season having fun with family and friends. And that's just what this family was doing. The Mackenzie family and the Ruffley family had organised holiday cottages in Woy Woy, just on the Brisbane waters. Now, back in 1921, there wasn't a lot of infrastructure or roads that had been built at this time to make it easier for the families to get to and from a particular spot where there were a lot of holiday cottages. On this particular spot, there was only one way across the Brisbane water between Gosford and Woy Woy, and it was via a train bridge. It wasn't odd for many people to be running across the train bridge to get to the other side. It wasn't a few metres, it was quite a distance for a family in particular to get from one side to the other. And on the 3rd of January 1921, just as it was getting dark, a family came to tragedy trying to get across that bridge. There was no pedestrian walkway on this bridge. It was simply a train bridge just for trains. One lane going from Gosford to Woy Woy and the other way. Now it was getting late and it was just getting on dark and the weather was awful. It started to rain. Mrs. Mackenzie had 4 of her children with her and Mr. Ruffley had one of his. They entered the train bridge to try and get to the other side. To save time, the only other route between Gosford and Woy Woy was by boat, and in this weather they wouldn't have even attempted it. But a simple quick run across the bridge wasn't going to take them too long, but it was one that would end many of their lives. Now, as most families have a few young children, they're not always listening to what you say, and they don't always do the right thing. On this afternoon, they'd been walking down a side where they could see a train coming. However, one of the boys walked across to the other side. Who knows why he did this? He may have been cranky. He may have just been a boy. He may have just been exploring. Either way, in a matter of moments, everything went from a great holiday to a family tragedy. They could hear the sound of a train coming. Mrs. Mackenzie, who actually had one of her daughters, Gladys, in her arms, who was only 2.5 years at the time, made her way across to the other line to try and get her son. What happened next was devastating. Remember, it's getting dark, it's raining. Mrs. Mackenzie's got a 2-year-old in her arms, trying to get an 8-year-old boy to do what she wants. She must have been calling to him to come across to the right side, but for whatever reason, Harold wouldn't come. She gets to the side, and Mr. Ruffley, who is also a member of the family, tells the other kids to stay aside, and he rushes up to try and help Mrs. Mackenzie, Harold and Gladys back to the right side. But unfortunately the train came too fast, couldn't stop in time. Unfortunately, it came straight through them. It almost took out one of the other children, who was very upset at the time, a 4-year-old Bruce. Luckily, Bruce lay flat and the train went over the top of him, but he survived. Unfortunately though, for Mrs. Mackenzie, 2-year-old Gladys, Harold and Mr. Ruffley, they were all taken by the train that day. It is believed Gladys somehow fell through the rail tracks down to the water below and drowned. She was found the next day. One of the oldest sisters narrowly missed the train. She quickly helped her younger brother Bruce, who'd laid flat. Once the train had stopped, she helped him get back from out underneath the train. Luckily he had survived, but what a mess. It must have been an awful ordeal for the family. The tragedy doesn't end there. In an awful twist of fate, we find other members of their family had a terrible tragedy on the same day, around the same time, and in almost the same exact circumstances. In Parramatta. On the 3rd of January 1921, a man by the name of Ambrose Patrick Whiting and his son William were going to go on a journey. A friend of theirs, Charlie Gow, who was a Chinese grocer on Church Street in Parramatta, had wanted to look at land in the Blue Mountains region. Ambrose must have known Oliver Hempel, who had purchased a motor car recently, a yellow Hubmobile, and they were all quite excited to go for a ride. So they journeyed up to the Blue Mountains. Oliver Hempel drove, with Charlie Gowan in the passenger seat, and Ambrose Whiting and his son William sat in the back. It must have been a really enjoyable day, up over the Blue Mountains and then down through Richmond to come back to Northmead where they lived. Everything went well until they got into Parramatta. It was around peak hour, 5 o'clock, and it must have been quite a busy time. The tram was journeying back to Parramatta, possibly their last route of the day, hurrying to try and make the time, but it wasn't going to end well. As we know from the Woy Woy accident, the weather wasn't the best for the day, and this could have also affected what was to happen next. It appears that the tram was coming down Church Street towards the Parramatta CBD area, across Lennox Bridge. Oliver was heading the car north, heading to Northmead, and for some strange reason, the tram driver saw him turn one way and then quickly turn the other to try and get out of the way. But in turning at the last minute, the right side of the tram impacted with the right side of the car, and the impact was head-on. Although the tram slowed down, it couldn't stop in time. The tram pushed the car along and it hit the gutter. In doing this, William was thrown from the vehicle. Unfortunately, this proved fatal for William. Ambrose, too, died at the scene. Nobody in the tram was hurt, and Mr. Gow, who was sitting in the passenger seat, sustained critical injuries. He died later in hospital. Oliver was also badly injured, but he survived. It was a terrible tragedy, as Mr. Ambrose Whiting and William Whiting were relatives of the Mackenzie and Ruffleys, and 6 people were buried as a result of this day. Mrs. Mackenzie and her children were buried at Point Clare Cemetery, not too far from where the accident occurred. Ambrose and William were buried in Maze Hill Cemetery in Parramatta. Thank you for watching this episode. We like to pay tribute to those in the past whose lives were taken so tragically.